the middle of the 14th century, the world did not end with a bang, nor with a whisper, but with a fever. It began innocuously enough, perhaps with a headache, a shivering chill that no blanket could warm, or a sudden exhaustion that made the limbs feel like lead. Then came the pain, dark, bulbous swellings, hard as rocks and agonizing to the touch, erupted in the armpits, the groin, and along the neck. These were the buboes, the devil's mark that gave the pestilence its name. Internal bleeding soon followed, creating black splotches beneath the skin, the gods' tokens that signaled imminent death. Breath became short and ragged, often accompanied by the coughing up of blood. From the moment the first symptom appeared to the moment the heart stopped beating, it was often a matter of mere days, sometimes only hours. Families went to bed healthy and woke up dying. The contagion moved with such terrifying speed that it outpaced the ability of the living to bury the dead. Church bells, which had rung for centuries to mark the canonical hours, began to toll incessantly for funerals until the sheer volume of death forced them into silence. Graveyards overflowed, forcing communities to dig mass trenches where bodies were stacked layer upon layer, like firewood, covered only by a thin dusting of earth. Across the cobblestone streets of Europe, a single terrifying question echoed in the minds of princes and peasants alike. Was this the apocalypse? Was this the divine judgment promised in the Book of Revelation? What the people of the Middle Ages did not realize was that they were living through the deadliest biological event in recorded human history. They were witnessing the arrival of the Black Death, a pandemic that would scour the known world, killing up to half of Europe's population and permanently altering the trajectory of human civilization. To truly grasp the scale of the horror that unfolded, we must first discard our modern prejudices about the era. The early 14th century was not a time of primitive darkness or stagnation. On the contrary, it was the zenith of the High Middle Ages, a period characterized by explosive growth, optimism, and intricate connectivity. For roughly 2 centuries, Europe had benefited from the medieval warm period, a climatic anomaly that ensured bountiful harvests and mild winters. The population had nearly doubled, forests were cleared, swamps were drained, and land that had been wild for millennia was brought under the plough. Cities like Paris, Venice, Florence, and London were bursting past their ancient Roman walls, evolving into dense, vibrant, and chaotic hives of commerce and culture. The great Gothic cathedrals were rising toward the heavens, stone by stone, symbolizing a society that felt technically capable and spiritually assured. Crucially, this was a world connected as never before. The Pax Mongolica, the peace of the Mongol Empire, had stabilized the vast trade routes stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea. A merchant in Genoa could purchase silk that had traversed the entirety of Asia without ever leaving a secured trade network. This medieval World Wide Web moved gold, spices, theology, and technology across continents with unprecedented efficiency. But this very connectedness, this triumph of medieval globalization, was the mechanism of its own undoing. The infrastructure for a global disaster was perfectly laid out. The ships and caravans that brought wealth were about to deliver an enemy that medieval science could not see, could not understand, and had absolutely no weapons to fight. The architect of this destruction was an ancient biological agent, a bacterium known as Yersinia pestis. Its origin lay thousands of miles from the bustling markets of Europe, deep in the windswept steppes of Central Asia, likely in the region of modern-day Kyrgyzstan. This bacterium is a ruthless survivalist, endemic to the burrowing rodent populations of the grasslands, specifically marmots and ground squirrels. For centuries, the bacteria existed in a relatively stable ecological balance with its hosts, far removed from dense human populations. However, in the 1330s, the delicate equilibrium of the steppes was shattered. Climate historians have identified a period of severe ecological stress, likely a devastating drought followed by intense rains, that destroyed the food sources of the wild rodents. Driven by starvation, the infected animals migrated closer to human settlements, bringing their fleas with them. The jump from animal to human likely occurred at the trading outposts along the Silk Road, where furs and grains were exchanged. The first human victims had no idea they were patient zeros in a global catastrophe. They simply fell ill, their bodies turning black, their lungs filling with fluid. News in the ancient world traveled at the speed of a horse or a sail, but rumors of the apocalypse traveled faster. By the early 1340s, fragmented, terrifying reports began to reach the ports of the Mediterranean. Merchants whispered of entire civilizations in the east vanishing overnight, of reigns of fire and pestilence that left India, Tartary, and Mesopotamia depopulated. The Europeans listened to these tales with a mix of horror and detachment, viewing them as distant tragedies in exotic lands, perhaps divine retribution for foreign beliefs. They had no concept of germ theory. They did not understand that the plague was not a localized curse, but a biological traveler moving steadily westward along the very trade routes that fueled their economies. The bacteria hitched rides in the grain sacks, in the folds of silk, and, most fatally, in the fur of the black rats that infested every ship and caravan. The geographical pivot point of this history, the door through which the plague entered Europe, was the Crimean Peninsula. Here sat the city of Kaffa, a fortified, incredibly wealthy colony of the Republic of Genoa. Kaffa was the hinge connecting the overland Asian routes to the maritime Mediterranean networks. In 1346, the city was under siege by the Golden Horde, a successor state of the Mongol Empire led by Khan Jani Beg. The siege had dragged on for months, a brutal stalemate between the Genoese defenders and the Mongol army. But then a silent killer began to stalk the Mongol camps. The besieging army, living in squalor with poor sanitation, became a breeding ground for the bacterium that had traveled with them from the east. Soldiers began dying by the hundreds, then thousands. The Mongol army was dissolving not from Genoese crossbows, but from biology. Facing defeat and watching his forces disintegrate, Jani Beg made a decision that would go down in history as one of the most horrific acts of biological warfare ever committed. He ordered the corpses of his plague-ridden soldiers to be loaded onto trebuchets. For days, the sky over Kaffa rained dead bodies. The Genoese defenders watched in horror as the pestilent corpses smashed onto roofs and into market squares, exploding on impact and spreading bodily fluids everywhere. The psychological terror was immense, but the biological impact was immediate. The bacteria, carried by the fluids of the corpses and the fleas, abandoning their cold hosts for warm living ones, infiltrated the city. The unbreakable fortress had been breached from within. Panic gripped Kaffa. The wealthy Genoese merchants, realizing the city was doomed, utilized their greatest asset, their ships. 12 Genoese galleys, loaded with refugees, gold, and unseen stowaways, slipped out of the harbor, fleeing past the dying Mongol army, heading for the safety of Italy. They believed they were escaping death. In reality, they were bringing it home. The journey of these 12 ships is the narrative thread of the plague's expansion. They sailed through the Bosphorus, past Constantinople, which was soon devastated itself, and into the open Mediterranean. This sea was the economic engine of Europe, a zone of intense, fast-moving trade. The fleeing ships became vectors of death, docking at major hubs to resupply, unknowingly seeding the infection at every stop. The first major European port to fall was Messina in Sicily in October 1347. When the Genoese galleys arrived, the dockworkers who rowed out to meet them were greeted by a scene from hell. Contemporary chroniclers record that most sailors were dead, their bodies rotting on deck. The few survivors were delirious, racked with pain, covered in black boils dripping blood and pus. The port authorities of Messina realized too late the nature of the cargo. They ordered the ships expelled, but the true agents of transmission, the black rats ubiquitous on medieval ships, and the fleas on their backs, had already used the mooring ropes to scurry onto the docks. Messina was the test case for Europe, and it failed miserably. The speed of the infection was paralyzing. The close-quartered living conditions of a medieval port city acted as an accelerant. Within weeks, the social fabric of Messina disintegrated. People fled the city for the countryside, only spreading the contagion further across the island. By early 1348, the great maritime republics were crumbling. Genoa, the home port of the ships from Kaffa, was devastated. Venice, the queen of the Adriatic, faced an existential threat. The Venetians, the most pragmatic of merchants, eventually developed the concept of the lazaretto, islands in the lagoon designated as quarantine zones, where arriving ships and crews had to wait 40 days, or 40 giorni, before entering the city. It was a pioneering public health measure that gave us the word quarantine. But for the first wave, it was too little, too late. The gondolas of Venice became funeral barges, piling bodies high as they navigated the silent canals. From the Italian ports, the disease moved west to Marseille, the great gateway to France, and crossed the Adriatic to Dubrovnik. The coastal perimeter of Europe was breached. Now the disease turned inland. As the plague moved away from the coasts, following river barges along the Rhone and carts along Roman roads, it encountered the dense heart of medieval Europe. Cities like Paris, Florence, London, and Barcelona were walled enclosures of winding, narrow alleys, multi-story timber houses that blocked out the sun, and open sewers running down the center of streets. They were incredibly vibrant, rich places. But hygienically, they were tinder boxes waiting for a spark. When the plague hit a major metropolis, it didn't just kill people, it killed the city itself as a functioning organism. We must understand the terror of facing this without the comfort of modern science. The best minds of the 14th century, the doctors of the University of Paris, were completely baffled. Their intellectual framework was not germ theory, but the ancient Greek theory of humours and miasma. They believed the air itself had been corrupted, perhaps by a specific planetary alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 that released noxious vapours from the Earth's core. Doctors advised people not to bathe, as it opened the pores to the corrupted air. They burned aromatic woods like juniper and rosemary in street corners to combat the smell of death. They bled patients who were already weakened by the disease to balance their humours. They lanced the buboes, which only served to spread the septicemic infection faster. Every rational attempt to stop the disease only seemed to feed it. The realization that their best knowledge was useless created a profound psychological crisis. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the devastation of Florence, a city that lost perhaps 60% of its population, left us chilling accounts of the social collapse. The terror of contagion was so great that the most sacred bonds of humanity were severed. Boccaccio wrote of fathers abandoning sons, wives leaving husbands to die alone in their beds, and neighbors bricking up the houses of the sick. The intricate machinery of medieval life stopped. Laws were ignored because there were no magistrates to enforce them. Courts closed. Bakeries stopped baking. The sounds of a busy city, carts, shouting merchants, construction, were replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the constant tolling of church bells, until the ringers themselves died, or authorities banned the bells to prevent panic. In the 14th century, there was no distinction between the physical world and the spiritual world. An event of this magnitude could only be interpreted as direct divine chastisement, God punishing humanity for its manifold sins of greed, pride, and corruption. The Church, the bedrock of medieval life, faced an impossible test. People flocked to cathedrals, praying for deliverance, massing together in processions that only served to spread the respiratory pneumonic form of the plague faster. When prayers failed and priests died just as quickly as sinners, a desperate radical piety emerged. The flagellant movement swept across northern Europe. Bands of hundreds of men, dressed in identical robes, marched from town to town. Twice a day in the public square, they would strip to the waist and whip themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes, drawing blood in a public display of penance, hoping to take the sins of the world onto their own flesh and appease God's wrath. They were a terrifying sight, bringing religious hysteria wherever they went. But as the death toll mounted, the need for a tangible scapegoat grew darker. If God was not listening, perhaps the devil was at work. A horrific conspiracy theory took root, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire and parts of Spain, that the Jewish communities were poisoning the wells of Christendom to wipe out the faithful. Despite official condemnations of these theories by Pope Clement VI, who pointed out that Jews were dying of the plague just as quickly as Christians, the mob mentality took over. Fueled by centuries of anti-Semitism and the desperate need to blame someone, horrific pogroms erupted. Entire communities in cities like Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne were rounded up and burned alive in wooden houses or town squares. The Black Death unleashed not just biological horror, but the darkest aspects of human nature. It is a mistake to think of the plague as purely an urban phenomenon. While cities were the epicenters, 90% of medieval Europe's population lived in the countryside. The plague traveled there too, carried by refugees fleeing the cities or itinerant peddlers. The devastation in rural areas was slower, but perhaps more profound in its long-term impact. Thousands of small villages, whose names are now lost to history, were completely wiped out. The manorial system, which relied on a steady supply of peasant labor to work the Lord's land, ground to a halt. Contemporary chronicles describe eerie rural scenes. Harvests rotting in the fields with no one to bring them in. Herds of sheep and cows wandering aimlessly through the landscape, eventually turning feral or dying of neglect because all the shepherds were dead. Wolves, emboldened by the lack of human presence, began encroaching closer to the remaining settlements. The carefully managed medieval landscape was being reclaimed by the wilderness. By 1350, the plague had reached the northern limits of the continent. Scotland, Scandinavia, and even the small settlements of Greenland, dealing a death blow to the Norse colonies there. It had burned through the entire continent, from the warm Mediterranean to the frozen north. By 1351, the plague began to subside as it simply ran out of victims. Approximately 75 to 200 million people died across Eurasia and North Africa. Europe lost half its population in just 5 years. The world was completely transformed. A severe labor shortage handed power to the peasantry, collapsing the serfdom system and ushering in the golden age of the laborer. Psychologically, art became obsessed with imagery, reminding us that in the face of death, all classes are equal. Medieval optimism shattered, giving way to a cynical society forced to adapt. This very tragedy paved the way for the rise of the modern world through medical advancements and new religious thought. The empty streets and fear of today remind us that pandemics are a test of civilization. And history repeats itself. I'm Pon. See you in the next era.